Thank you so much. I want for you to have a little more information about our speaker today, who is a local person. He graduated from Roosevelt High School, earned undergraduate degrees in physics and history, and a doctorate in history of science. While he was a graduate student, he worked for the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History and for the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. He did postdoctoral work in history and philosophy of science before he came back to Seattle to join the UW Department of History. Among other things he does at UW is he's also the editor of the Pacific Northwest Quarterly, the Journal for Regional History. And Dr. Williams, I wanted you to know this too. The Ballard Rotary has provided scholarships for some of your wonderful students. And in 1919, 1920, we provided a scholarship for Oscar Homa for firefighting. And the reason I'm telling you that is I want you to all know that Bruce is a firefighter, and I think this is very interesting. He's also a firefighter for Okanagan County District 6, which covers about 380 miles in the Methow Valley. He's trained as both a structural and wildland firefighter and as a driver operator for fire engines. And he's currently lieutenant assigned to the Winthrop Station. He's also a nationally certified advanced emergency medical technician and volunteers for Aero Meteo Rescue Service. I know that's not part of his talk today, but I thought that you should know that about him. So welcome, Dr. Hevly.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. Can you all hear me okay?
Kathleen, okay. You're muted.
Great, great.
Yes, we can hear you very well. And I just turned off the screen share and allowed you to share your screen if you so desired.
Okay, thank you. So let me do that.
He's cute.
Okay, I mean, it's especially kind of you to invite someone from Roosevelt to crash your little Ballard party. My dad went to Ballard, actually, but you know, we were living the American dream and he wanted something better for his children, so I went to Roosevelt. So I'm going to talk to you very briefly today about the role played by an urban movement to solve an urban problem as it was perceived at the end of the 19th century. That urban movement was target shooting. And target shooting, I would argue, was used to bring industrial values into play in order to discipline an unruly industrial city. The city was New York, and the agent in applying those values was Teddy Roosevelt, who carried out a program of efficiency and improvement, as he understood it, at the very end of the 19th century in the New York City Police Department. And that movement centered on a particular artifact, the police revolver. I'm a historian of physics and technology, so part of what I try to do is understand the decisions that we've made to understand the world the way we do, and also to use the world in the ways that we do. And so I try to come up with explanations that don't appeal to some inevitable solution being arrived at, but make those solutions a matter of historical contingency. And that's the kind of story I hope to tell you today. Now, certainly throughout the 19th century, firearms are not unknown in New York City. This is an illustration of the New York City draft riots during the Civil War, where firearms in the hands of military units were used to restore order in the streets. In 1867, the Army and Navy Journal complained that there were squads of undisciplined men with firearms roaming the streets of New York City. The first law enforcement group that I know of to use a standard issue firearm were actually federal representatives who were commissioned to protect Republican voters in New York City during the elections of 1876. And those federal agents were all armed with a standard issue weapon. Weapons in the hands of the police, though, were much more irregular, and they weren't regularized until Teddy Roosevelt became a police commissioner at the very end of the 19th century. In the meantime, the military forces of New York State, including the guard units in the city of New York, had undergone a tremendous transformation. The militia disappeared in America in the course of the 19th century. It was replaced by guard units in most states. And the guard, in turn, was pretty much permanently federalized in 1903. In the later part of the 19th century, New York City's guard units had created for themselves these sort of magnificent urban strong points, National Guard armories around the city. And those armories really kind of reflect in architecture a great change that had taken place in the Guard, because the Guard was itself disciplined by the advent of mandatory marksmanship training, which started in 1873 at a new rifle range built with state money by the National Rifle Association at a place called Creedmoor on Long Island. And so the story that I have to tell today is going to skip over some of that earlier history in order to get to something I felt I could do in 20 minutes. And that involves focusing on this character, Teddy Roosevelt. When Teddy Roosevelt, who was a very dedicated reformer, decided to try to take a grip on the New York City Police Department, one of the resources that he brought to bear was this marksmanship training that I've referred to. He had some experience of that himself. He was a member of the New York Guard as a young man after his graduation from Harvard College, and during his somewhat fitful attendance at law school in New York City. Roosevelt would have participated in rifle marksmanship training at Creedmoor on Long Island. And in fact, as a teenager, Roosevelt's family returned to New York City from a long overseas tour in 1873, the year that, to great excitement in the city of New York, Creedmoor opened for target shooting competitions. Newspapers and magazines in New York kind of amplified the role of Creedmoor. One of them suggested that target shooting was almost certainly to be the American pastime, that baseball was kind of okay as far as it went, but that rifle marksmanship was a much more kind of all-American activity. So Roosevelt, who was a keen shooter as a young person, I think would have been very aware of Creedmoor during the time that he grew up. And here we have a sort of often reproduced image of Roosevelt as the young man. This is associated with the period in which he went west and became, for a couple of years, a cattle rancher in the Dakotas. We could spend an hour just sort of deconstructing the outfit that he has on here. It has several kind of elements of myth. It's a studio picture. It's not a picture that was taken in the Dakotas. You can see the Bowie knife in his belt, which came from Tiffany's in New York City. You can see he has a custom rifle there. You can see the oval plate on the buttstock that denotes it's a custom Winchester rifle. Roosevelt, who was a very successful author, wrote at great length about firearms that he used in his life as a rancher and as a volunteer law enforcement officer on the frontier, part of promoting what he called the strenuous life of a good muscular American at the end of the 19th century. So when you hear that Teddy Roosevelt is the person who decided that the New York City police would carry a standard weapon and that that weapon would be a Colt revolver, it seems like something that almost explains itself. Of course, Roosevelt would pick a sort of a cowboy pistol for people to carry. Of course, this would reflect his experience on the frontier that he wrote about in books like Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail, where Roosevelt laid out all his advice on what were the best firearms for any given situation, what kind of firearm you should take to a gunfight, how to behave if people disrespected you in a saloon. It seems almost intuitively obvious that Roosevelt would choose a Colt revolver for the New York City police. But in fact, I think it's a mistake to ascribe that to his frontier experience. Here's a little excerpt from a letter that Roosevelt wrote during the time he was out in the Dakotas. It describes a bear hunt that he went on. Roosevelt, with a guide, followed a bear into the bear's den where the bear was sleeping. And they woke the bear up, and then Roosevelt shot it. And so Roosevelt describes it. Doubtless my face was pretty white, but the blued barrel was as steady as a rock as I glanced along it until I could see the top of the bead fairly between the bear's two sinister looking eyes. As you will see when I bring home his skin, the bullet hole in his skull was as exactly between his eyes as if I had measured the distance with a carpenter's rule. So what I'd argue here is that this actually betrays the roots of a lot of Roosevelt's thinking about marksmanship, that Roosevelt spent relatively little time in the West. Roosevelt came from an urban shooting environment where marksmanship training was used to instill habits of self-discipline in unruly people. And the values that got associated with those practices were what I would call industrial values of precision and accuracy and measurement. And those are things that get instilled in formal marksmanship training. So as Roosevelt's life went on, about a decade later, Roosevelt returned to the East. He started to renew his career in politics, which he had interrupted, to go west. He was a member of the Federal Civil Service Commission, which was trying to reform federal hiring practices. And after passing on an opportunity to run for the mayor of New York City, a successful reform mayor who was elected in 1894 asked Roosevelt if he would like to join the police commission, which was a committee that oversaw the New York Police Department. Roosevelt joined the police commission, seems to have sort of declared himself the president of the commission, and set about trying to reform what he regarded as a very corrupt police department. And so here you can see a cartoon of Roosevelt at work. He's rolling up his sleeves to change the way things are done in New York City, largely by changing the culture of policing in New York City. And Roosevelt believed that new technology would make this possible. So he relied on bicycles, telephones, and the police revolver as technologies that allowed him to sort of sweep away some of the sort of dark areas of corruption in the police department by forcing police officers to be more kind of integrated into a citywide organization and more responsive to directions from above. Again, among the resources he had to do that with was an examination system, something he had worked to develop as a member of the Civil Service Commission. This sort of reform idea at the end of the 19th century was that you took favoritism out of a hiring system by requiring people to take exams. And Americans have been in love with exams as a mark of honest achievement since the 19th century. Everything from civil service exams to intelligence tests, which began being widely used during World War I, to the SAT exams that came about after World War II. We love the idea of sort of the objective measurement of worth that exams allow. So every police officer under Roosevelt's regime was required to provide himself with a Colt police revolver caliber .32-20 and to pass a marksmanship exam using this revolver. And those who could not pass the exam would be sort of filtered out of the New York City Police Department. Roosevelt instituted written exams as well. So before long, there was a whole kind of testing regime surrounding the police department. And here, you know, depending on how much of your screen is observed, this is a little close-up of one of the features of a Colt revolver. In the rubber grips, the Colt molded a little motif there they called thug versus cop, which again, you know, suggests the advantage that the firearm gives to the police officer. The thug has a knife, the cop has a gun, and we all remember, I think, Sean Connery in The Untouchables. You know, if they bring a knife, if you bring a gun, if they send one of yours to the hospital, you send one of theirs to the morgue. That's the recipe for, you know, policing, according to Sean Connery. But again, you know, I'd really urge you to think about the significance of the revolver in a slightly different way. The firearm in this sort of target shooting regime is not just about something like naked force. And when confronted with a riot, Roosevelt would say, "Out clubs," to the police department. He didn't have them shooting down people in the streets. The most common use of a revolver for a police officer in the late 19th century was for shooting a rabid dog. But the whole effort of taking on the mindset of target shooting that really had sort of disciplined and cleaned up New York's guard units, turning them from just another street gang into a kind of disciplined military force, was the kind of thing that Roosevelt wanted to apply to the police as well. And the resource that he had for that was the target shooting culture that had filtered from Creedmoor into the culture of New York City. Again, this is a culture in which people are urged to turn themselves into a machine rest. That is, to imagine themselves as a piece of technology, as sort of rigid and as steady as something a machinist would use in creating a precision instrument. The instrument that Roosevelt had to draw on in particular was this marksman on the right, Sergeant William Petty, who was an avocational target shooter and became the director of the marksmanship program. It took place at a National Guard armory in New York City, and it became the foundation of the first police academy, which just began simply as education for shooters in the New York Police Department. But again, this artifact itself drew on Colt's long established reputation for precision in manufacturing. So the modern revolver, as Colt developed it through a number of iterations, relied on all sorts of very precisely machined parts. It's an intricate device with a lot of moving parts, and also the ability to contain a fairly significant explosion so that you can safely hold it in your hand or even hold it near your face while you're operating it. Colt carefully built up this reputation starting from before they were actually able to deliver weapons with interchangeable parts machined to these sorts of tolerances. The original Colonel Colt used to just lie about what was in his revolvers, but over the decades, Colt learned to deliver what it had promised in terms of an intricate precision mechanism. And this emphasis on accuracy and sobriety resonates with the program that Roosevelt wanted to instill. Roosevelt, like a lot of members of his class, saw America changing markedly in the 19th century. And so Roosevelt is, like a lot of people of his ilk, he was something of a conservative reformer. He looked throughout the city and said, what I want on the police department are men from the old immigrant groups, the Scandinavians, the Germans, men of strong physique, resolute temper, sober, self-respecting, and self-reliant. Those are the kinds of people who will match the system that Roosevelt thought he was building. With adoption by the police of the police revolver, the official police, the police positive, the new police, as Roosevelt styled these weapons, they were marketed to everybody. And this is a pattern that persists to this day, in which police firearms are marketed very broadly to consumers. They are, marketed as safe, sure, effective. And Roosevelt was very worried about the city. He was worried about the changes he saw happening around them. And before long, when Black Americans began to undertake the Great Migration to northern cities, they were greeted with police officers armed with revolvers who had been trained to see the display and use of firearms as a way to instill control in the city, with themselves as sort of the exemplars of self-discipline in the use of force. So I think, this is it's a very kind of fateful decision that Roosevelt undertook to rely on this particular technology as part of his efforts to reform the New York Police Department. And with that, I will stop and thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. David Rice, host. Please plug the questions.
Bruce, thank you for your presentation. I'm a huge Teddy Roosevelt fan, and I appreciate any chance that we can to get to see him. Hang on just a second.
Bruce, that was a great presentation. I grew up around guns heavily, and when I looked at my own journey after hearing this, it all revolved around target shooting, whether it was a turkey shoot, a .22 caliber rifle that was a target rifle that we rebuilt, my dad and I, it's interesting being in the Marine Corps where we spent 2 weeks, 1 week not even just dry firing, and then another week actually firing every year, 2 weeks in the Marine Corps, all again revolving around target practice. One of the few services where you had that every 2 weeks for a week, 8 hours a day, just holding the rifle in several different positions. So that's really extraordinary.
Yeah, and, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, I'll just say that so, this is part of a much larger story, and the National Rifle Association, when it was established in 1871, was established again with New York State funding to provide rifle training for the New York militia, partly because New York didn't want to use the federally issued rifle. They wanted to spend money on a New York product, which was a Remington rifle. But a lot of the founders of the NRA had been officers in the Civil War, and they confronted what Americans tend to confront every time there's a war, which is they discover that despite the fact that Americans like to think that they're a nation of riflemen, Americans actually can't shoot. And so it takes a huge amount of work to train people to shoot. And so as it happens in New York City, the first organized interscholastic sport was target shooting.
Wow.
And when Teddy Roosevelt became president, he had a kind of courtesy appointment as also president of the new Boy Scouts of America, and he insisted that every Boy Scout camp in the US had a rifle range, because he thought that citizenship training began with marksmanship training to try to kind of solve this problem. So after World War I, most Boy Scout troops were sponsored by the American Legion, and marksmanship was a big part of what they did.
Bruce, Teddy Roosevelt was a police commissioner along with a couple of other individuals. It strikes me that we don't really hear very often of a police commissioner anymore. Usually the police chief reports to the mayor, as they do here in Seattle. Was the police commissioner role in innovation as well? And what types of things did they confront in terms of police culture at the time that they took over? And how had that police culture changed by the time that Roosevelt stopped being a police commissioner?
The commission that Roosevelt served on was legislated out of existence shortly after he left. It was a 3-person board, and it could exist in kind of one of two forms. One would be to sort of endorse the way that the New York City Police Department had always been run, which was as a kind of patronage enterprise that ran on bribes. And the biggest source of bribes was illegal alcohol sales on Sundays, so that bars and taverns couldn't be open in New York City on Sundays. The police department looked the other way in exchange for payments, and those payments went up through the New York City political establishment, through the police department, and then into the electoral system. When Roosevelt joined the board, he found an ally in a retired Army officer named Avery Andrews, who was also a member of the board, and kind of threw his lot in with Roosevelt. The third member of the board was a kind of unrepentant defender of the old system, where everything worked by patronage. You had to have a sponsor to get on the department, and then as you collected bribes, you would kick them up, via your sponsor into the system. And so Roosevelt, found himself in a lot of kind of political fights with this one commissioner. After Roosevelt left the board, the state legislature changed the system so that there was a single commissioner, and that commissioner could be appointed with some constraints by the mayor. As I understand it, New York politics often revolves around the fact that the city of New York is a Democratic city in a Republican state. And so the state legislature is often at odds with the city. And Roosevelt came kind of at the end of the great age of Tammany Hall, when New York worked quite well, but was in many ways very corrupt. And so changes around the police commission were often undertaken to try to either reduce corruption or reinstitute it.
Do we have any other questions from the?
There's a question in the chat from Kathleen Linscott.
Oh, right. Thank you, Kathleen. Kathleen said, did Teddy Roosevelt have a favorite firearm?
Well, I've tried to figure out in this book I'm trying to write. So as a historian of technology, I have tried to really focus on sort of actual firearms and how actual firearms worked in this period. So the 22 that was mentioned before, that was a really important innovation by the DuPont company to make a rifle for kids, basically. Yeah. And developing the ammunition that could be used in that rifle was very, very difficult to do. So there's a whole kind of technical story about that. The problem is a lot of firearms, exist in the realm of fantasy. So Roosevelt wrote these, in some of his books about Western life, he would write these big lists of firearms and what firearms were good for what. And at that point, he really, really liked the Winchester rifle in a pretty heavy caliber for his life in the West. And in that picture of him, you saw the cartridge belt he's wearing. It has really big cartridges in it. It's a very heavy rifle. Later in his life, Roosevelt switched to a Mauser patterned rifle, a bolt action rifle, which was more like a modern military rifle after the turn of the century. And he used that for his little hunting trips that he went on. But I think he would sort of say, firearms are tools and you have to pick the tool for the job. So when he went on safari to Africa or he went exploring down the Amazon, he would carry a different kind of weapon than he did when he was, hunting for small game around Washington, D.C., which he did pretty enthusiastically as president. But I mentioned the Mauser rifle just because it kind of shows the interaction between military designs and civilian designs around the turn of the century. I could only guess that Roosevelt was pretty fond of the Colt revolvers that he carried as an officer in the Spanish-American War. But I don't know that he ever, I don't remember him ever talking about an absolute favorite that I can recall.
John?
Well, Bruce, we want to thank you so much for sharing with us today your insights and information about the historical Teddy Roosevelt and the changes in the police culture around New York City, and of course, the influence of technology on both of those. In your honor today, 300 pounds of food will be donated to Hunger Against Harvest. And just by taking a little bit of time to enlighten and educate us, we're going to help some other people get some food, which is a fantastic thing. So thank you so much for taking part of your day and part of your schedule to bring us this great information, this presentation. Thank you so much.